to be here to talk with all of you today. My main goal is to help all of you consider getting out of your gender box and adopting the attributes that we would typically think of as being both masculine and feminine. Because if you can do that, you're ultimately going to be able to play to your individual strengths and be a more successful individual. And your companies will be more successful as well. You see, we have these ideas that men should be independent, self-sufficient, bottom line oriented. They should be strong and courageous, and they shouldn't show emotion. Meanwhile, we expect women to be soft and nurturing, and they should be collaborative and consensual. And as a result, we end up having two different kinds of leaders: the strong, independent masculine energy and the supportive, collaborative feminine energy. And my goal is to help each and every one of us think that we can be both and that we're not either or. These ideas are very pervasive. They start when we're young, and I had an experience very early in my career that had a big impact on me and how important it was to get out of what I call our gender box. So you heard that I used to be with Potash, which is now has merged, and the new company is called Nutrien. But one of its primary commodities when I was working there was potash. And it's like any other commodity: when there's too much capacity and not enough demand, prices fall and companies lose money. We were not only losing money, we were bleeding red. And our board fired our CEO, and they brought in a new CEO. And our new CEO was not only from outside the company, he was from outside the country. He was from Southern United States. And to those of us in Saskatchewan, he talked funny. Well, he came in, he was a very masculine energy guy. He displayed all the attributes you would think of as being very masculine. He had been a US military man. He walked very erectly with a lot of confidence. He was very analytical. I used to make jokes. I called him a walking, talking Viagra tablet. He came into our company, he looked at the numbers, he did the analysis, and he said, "We have too much production. We have to close the mine." People in our province were up in arms. How dare this outsider come and close down one of our mines? Those were our jobs. Somebody wrote a letter to the editor of the paper, and they said, "This guy can't manage his way out of a pay toilet." Well, now it was his turn to get up in arms, and he demanded to know who wrote that letter. And we executives were scurrying around trying to figure it out. And what we found is that the address on the letter was accurate, the phone number was accurate, but the name was fictitious. The address and the phone number belonged to one of our hourly paid workers. But he didn't write the letter. His wife did. I expected to see our CEO dial up his masculine energy and snuff out the competition, because that is what I had seen from men that I had worked for thus far in my career. And he surprised me. He switched right over and started using the attributes of the feminine. He didn't leverage that advantage. He looked for a winning solution. He phoned her up. He didn't have a secretary call. He didn't have and he told her how and shared his story to find common ground. And he said, "You know, I used to be the son of a miner." He was an hourly paid worker in the coal mines in Southern Kentucky. And we had to move a lot when I was young. And I'll never forget leaving behind my best friend, Billy, because I never saw Billy again. Well, by the time that coffee meeting was over, she was his new best friend. She put him on her Christmas card list. More importantly, she went out and told all the other hourly paid workers and their friends that he was doing the best that he could do for the entity. I watched someone use the attributes of both genders. He used the attributes of the masculine in order to make the tough decision to close that plant. And then he used the attributes of the feminine to turn an adversary into an advocate. And each and every one of us have that ability, but we have to get out of our gender box, those preconceived ideas that are developed when we're children. You see, when we stifle our natural gifts and talents in order to fit into a gender box, we're not playing to our strengths and being the best individual that we can be. And that hampers us because we need to play to our strengths in order to be successful. It also hurts our company's productivity, because if you're a manager, your job is to hire the very best talent and put that talent in the right position and then develop that talent. But when people are stifling who they really are in order to fit in, important productivity is lost and we don't really know who those people are. So it's to our advantage and it's to our company's advantage for each and every one of us to get out of our gender box and use the attributes.
Sorry.
Yes.
It's time for snacks for everyone.
So does that mean you want me to carry on or you want me to wait until you've had snacks?
Please carry on, Betty. Sorry, I think they were just acknowledging that their mic was making noise.
Okay. So there's a lot of research on these ideas of these stereotypes of what we think a man is and what we think a woman is, or what they should be, are deeply embedded in our psyche. And there's a lot of research that shows that. There's a woman named Lyra Borotsky who's a professor at Stanford, and she's a linguist. And in the languages, there are certain languages like French and German and Spanish and Russian, where they take nouns and denote them by having them be either described as masculine or feminine. So she took a picture of a bridge to people in Germany. And in Germany, a bridge is considered feminine. And she asked the people to describe this bridge. And they said, it's pretty, it's slender, it's elegant. Then she took exactly the same picture of exactly the same bridge to people in Spain, where a bridge is considered masculine. And she asked them to describe the bridge. You can imagine what they said. It's bold, it's sturdy, it's strong. So both countries, the people imbued those bridges, the same bridge, with the attributes of what they subconsciously believe the feminine should be and the masculine should be. There was another study done at the University of Illinois where they found that female hurricanes are 3 times as deadly as male hurricanes. It had nothing to do with the strength of the storm. It had everything to do with the name of the hurricane. If people thought that Hurricane Victor was coming, they thought, it's a male, it's strong, button down the hatches, evacuate. But if they thought Hurricane Victoria was coming, they thought, it's female, it's going to be weaker, we don't need to worry. And as a result, many of them lost their lives. So this is deeply embedded in our psyche about what we believe masculine should be and what we believe feminine should be. And it starts from the day that we're born. Little boys are encouraged to venture off and skin their knees, while little girls are encouraged to sit quietly by their mothers. There's research that shows that parents hold a baby boy and say, look how active he is, how he's squirming. He doesn't want to be held. And look at this little girl, how cuddly she is. And yet outside observers noticed no difference whatsoever in the behavior of those babies. But the parents were imbuing their children with the attributes of the masculine or the feminine based on their sex, in the same way that those people in Germany and Spain were imbuing the characteristics of those bridges based on whether they thought they were masculine or feminine. There was another study that showed jack-in-the-boxes, and the observers were told, these are boys and these are girls. Describe the reaction when the jack-in-the-box jumps out. And for the boys, they said, oh, he's angry. And for the girls, they said, oh, she's fearful. But of course, they weren't told that this was the boy and this was the girl. They were told opposite. So again, they were imbuing them with it. So we expect boys to be angry. We expect girls to be fearful. And then it happens with kids' toys and their social media, or not our social media, our media. Consider Sesame Street. Many of us probably watched that growing up. Mostly males, Bert, Ernie, Cookie Monster. The only female was Miss Piggy, and she was vain and bossy. So not exactly a good role model for a little girl, and not exactly a good role model for what a little boy thinks a little girl should be. And then these children go to school. And the research shows that teachers spend 2/3 of their time encouraging boys to look more deeply at an issue and to interact with them and talk about that, while they expect girls to sit quietly by. And then there's peer pressure. Little boys are expected to talk about sports and cars, while little girls are expected to think about their appearance and try to get the attention of the boys. And then there's religion. We're taught that it's very hierarchical, and the top of the pyramid is always male. So it's pretty hard for young girls to see one, be one. So we have all of this research that shows that we expect boys to act one way and we expect girls to act another way. And that means that we all are socialized into doing that. Additionally, it's difficult because we have in our society come to the conclusion that the attributes of the masculine are more valuable than the attributes of the feminine. I felt this growing up. I always knew that if I displayed the attributes of the masculine, that meant that I was usually held in higher esteem. My brother, if I dressed him and his friends up in my clothes to have a playtime fashion show as little kids, they were ridiculed. One of the little boys was actually punished by his father. No little boy wants to be perceived as a little girl. If a little girl can climb, you're doing snakes and ladders, it's like we're climbing the ladder. If we can be more like a boy, and they act like a girl and they take the big snake downwards. And this all then means that boys learn at a very young age that the most value they can have is to be as far away as they can from being feminine. And emotions are related to the feminine, or we expect girls to have emotions. Boys then quickly mutate their emotions into anger and don't express it. And that means that as they grow up and become executives, it's more difficult for them to feel empathy. It's more difficult for them to engender the loyalty of their employees because they're not understanding or feeling where they're coming from. I watched this happen with the guys in my office. You know, we're all like musical instruments. We tune ourselves to those that were around. Other executives would come in my office and talk to me with a lot of heart about their children and their hopes and dreams for their kids, or maybe any problems they were having. And yet when I would see them in the boardroom, they would be tough. And they'd say to the other guys, we're not letting people get away with that or tell us what to do. It was like they were tuning themselves to the other guys that they were with and how they were expected to act. And all of this means that we're creating a subconscious bias that says that men should act a certain way and women should act another. You see, our brains are processing millions of pieces of data every day. And that means that they start taking shortcuts. They start taking shortcuts in order to make it easier to draw a conclusion. And there's been lots of studies done on subconscious bias. One of them out of Yale showed that when you put a briefcase in front of people, their subconscious immediately starts thinking about what they should be doing with work. But if you put out a cleaning product and they breathe it, the subconscious immediately says, oh, it's time to start cleaning up. So we all have these subconscious biases, and we start from the time that we are born in developing them. By the time a baby is 3 months old, the research shows that they start to distinguish differences. And research out of the University of Toronto shows that by the time they are 6 months old, they will start discriminating. So I really believe that gender is a social construct, that we're all individuals, but we construct that we are supposed to be the attributes of the masculine or the attributes of the feminine based on all of the messages that we have been sent from the time that we're born. It's our subconscious telling us that women should act one way and men should act another. And all of us have these prejudices, we're just not aware that we have them. And because of subconscious bias, people that don't adhere to the attributes of their gender are penalized. So for example, we believe in our society that the attributes of the masculine are interchangeable with leadership. And yet, so we as women have to display those attributes of the masculine in order to be considered leaders. At the same time, if we are women and we're not displaying the attributes of the feminine, people are going to think there's something wrong with us. Our subconscious is going to be sending messages, alarm bells, saying that we don't fit in. So that means that as women and leaders, we have to be able to do both. We have to display the attributes of leadership and still display the attributes that people expect us to and be feminine, or some of the attributes of the feminine, or at least modulate it. So for example, there was a study out of the University of Michigan that showed that when women are applying for jobs, if they describe themselves as having the attributes of the masculine, you know, I'm independent, I'm self-sufficient, I'm bottom line oriented, I'm achievement, I'm goal oriented, those women will get hired. If women describe themselves using the attributes of the feminine, I'm nurturing, I'm collaborative, I'm supportive, they likely won't get the job. Another piece of research that's very interesting came out of the Stanford Business School. They tracked 132 of their female graduates over 11 years. And they found that the women who displayed the attributes of the masculine, but cloaked them in a lot of the attributes of the feminine, were promoted not only more than other women, they were promoted more than men. But the real secret was that they had to make sure that they showed themselves as having the attributes of the masculine to be seen as leaders, but they couldn't do it too much. They had to scale it back and make sure that they were also being collaborative and consensual and empathetic. There was another piece of research, or another actually article in Atlantic magazine that talked about Columbia Business School. And they talked about how important it was for men to display the attributes of the feminine. And they said in their MBA program, which at the time of the article was 90% men, it's probably changed now. The article was done in, I think, 2011. They said, we are teaching the business school, our business school students to read body language and facial expressions, because we're doing so much business internationally, and there's so many cultural differences that we want our students to be able to read and intuit what the people across the table are thinking and how they may react. So we're really teaching, what they said in the article was, we're really teaching them the attributes of the feminine, but we don't dare tell the guys that, or they wouldn't accept it and wouldn't want to do it. So all of this says, you know, we used to think that men were one way and women were another way because their brains were different. And in fact, in the 90s, there was all kinds of books written, the female brain, the male brain, and I read them all. And all the things that they said in those books was debunked by a study that came out of the University of Tel Aviv in December of 2015. They put 1,400 men and women through an MRI. And what they found is that those brains, the brains that we would consider to be masculine or feminine, were fewer than 1%. Amazing, isn't it? And what they found is that all of us are our brains are a myriad of characteristics. Some of those we would consider to be masculine, some we would consider to be feminine, and we're all different. So we need to be who we really are and live up to what our brain says, who we are. There was another study done by a woman named Cornelia Find, and she's at the University of Melbourne. And she analyzed testosterone and published in a book called Testosterone Rex, which won the Royal Society Science Book Prize in 2017. And what she said is that both men and women, their testosterone will rise when they're under stress or taking risks, and their testosterone will fall when they are doing something like taking care of a baby. So she said, behavior, testosterone follows behavior as opposed to behavior following testosterone. So it's another thing, another argument that people would have made at one time for why men would be one way and women would be another. And the most recent research shows that that doesn't hold any water either. So again, I come back to my thesis, which is that gender is a social construct, and that each of us are individuals made up of a myriad of characteristics, and we'll all be better off if we use all the characteristics the way my boss did in the first story that I told. So one of the things that happens is that even though there are people that would say there is a big difference between the genders, even they can't justify the actual changes, the big gap there is between the two right now. So for example, the pay gap there's not enough to justify a 30%. There's only such minor differences between the genders. Men grow taller, they are physically stronger, they sweat more. Women have greater peripheral vision. It doesn't justify 30% difference in the pay graph, a pay scale. Then we have 80% of senior management are men. Those small physical differences don't justify that either. And what happens is that when we are only being one or the other, we have the tendency to ramp things up to the extreme because we're out of balance. So that then leads to something that you've heard a lot about lately because it's been in the media. It's called toxic masculinity. It's when you take the ability to be directive and you are under stress, maybe under pressure, maybe tired, really attached to an outcome. And what you do is you dial it up to the extreme and you become domineering. So a strength becomes a weakness. My mother used to always say too much of a good thing is a bad thing. As a result of that, the American Psychology Association started recommending that psychiatrists and psychologists actually consider toxic masculinity as part of their guidelines in the way that they treat their clients. And kind of hot on the heels of that happening a year ago, Gillette came out with an ad that encouraged men to forget about some of their misogynistic behavior. And it's interesting, but usually the American Medical Association would bring out a recommendation and nobody pay any attention to it. But gender is so loaded. People, from the time they're born, they're labeled pink or blue, they line up, they take sides, they try to make their side right, the other side wrong. And between the Gillette ad and the American Psychology Association coming out with that recommendation, there were so many online comments, it was unbelievable. And they were, many of them derogatory, saying things like, well, let women defend the fort and then go home and have a manicure. If they don't want us, we'll just leave them and they'll be sorry for it, et cetera, et cetera. So none of the working together. If you don't accept the way things have been, we're not accepting any change. And of course, what's interesting is if you have toxic masculinity, you also can have toxic femininity, although people aren't talking about that, but I think it does deserve some consideration. So for example, because right now we have a system where men tend to dial it up to the extreme and we expect them to be more domineering, what happens in those circumstances is that women can tend to fold themselves into a man, and whatever he wants, they make that their goal, and they get up every day wondering how they can help that man achieve his goals as opposed to even thinking about what they want for themselves. And unfortunately, some of them don't even know what they want for themselves. So It's to our advantage not only to play to our strengths, but to prevent us from dialing it up to the extreme, from taking these attributes and letting them get out of balance, so that we are not, each and every one of us want to be able to make plans, but also consider the results. We want to be able to take time for ourselves, but also spend time with others. We want to make sure that we advance the needs of the group without giving ourselves away. So it's always a balance between doing both. And we want to be able to do that. So we want, hopefully, if we can find that balance, we can encourage women to put up their hand and volunteer for a stretch assignment, because that's when they're going to be seen as a leader. And maybe we can actually encourage some men to feel their feelings. And no one ever died from crying. You know, managing these polar opposites can be tricky. It's easier to be one or the other and just forget about the others. But as F. Scott Fitzgerald said, the test of true intelligence is to hold the ability to hold two opposing thoughts at the same time and retain your ability to function. So how do we get there? Well, we can take a page out of the book of some 5-year-old children who were part of a study at Stanford in the 1960s. You've probably seen some videos on this because they're on YouTube. They took children and they put them in a room and they put a marshmallow in front of them. And they said, we're going to leave the room for 15 minutes. If you don't eat that marshmallow, you can have lots more later. And then they left the room. Well, you can see these kids squirming and fighting with themselves. They want to eat that marshmallow so badly, yet they want to have another marshmallow later. Well, as you can imagine, some of the kids ate them and some of the kids didn't. And then they followed up a couple of decades later. And they found that those children who did not eat the marshmallow had higher SAT scores, were university educated, fewer divorces, and a higher ability to earn money. So what those kids were able to do is hold two opposing thoughts at the same time. I want that marshmallow now, but I want more marshmallows later. They're able to do both. And that's what I want for each and every one of you. I want you to be able to plan while keeping your eye on the goal. I want you to be able to speak, find your voice, but also take time to listen. I want you to be able to think of the process while considering the end result. I want you to consider the group without losing yourself. It's important to be able to do both, and that means that we have to get out of our gender box. So if we can get out of this gendered conditioning, we can give up our subconscious bias, and we're going to do better as individuals. And it's kind of like drawing water from a tap. If you want a relaxing bath, if you want to quench your thirst, you turn on the cold water and you drink. If you want a relaxing bath, you turn on the hot, maybe you turn on the cold, you might adjust it a little bit to get the right temperature. It's still H2O. So when you're adjusting, you're still you being you. It's just that you are presenting yourself in a slightly different way, and you're using the attributes of both genders. I would encourage each and every one of you to think about getting out of your gender box, using the attributes of both genders, because if you do, you're going to be like, until now, you've been like a bird flying on one wing, and you'd be able to be like a bird flying on both wings. You can fly further and higher and faster than ever before. I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Betty-Ann. I really appreciate your time. Does anybody have any questions that they want to hop in and ask? You're more than welcome to unmute your mics and ask away. If not, I have some questions. Okay. So I'm an undergraduate student, and
You're what kind of student?
Undergraduate.
Okay.
Yeah. And I identify with this topic, I think, in a much different way than you do. And I'm wondering how, like in your abstract, you mentioned about, you know, we can kind of combat and eliminate stereotypes and all that stuff, but how do you perceive this kind of talk as achieving that when you spend so much time focusing on, you know, you calling things masculine energy and feminine energy when those aren't really things? Like, your boss was a good leader, and a good leader, he didn't channel masculine or feminine energy because those aren't things.
So it's an interesting thing, Laurel, because we have so many preconceived biases around the words gender. And ultimately, I would like it to be more like, it doesn't matter if you're left-handed or right-handed. It doesn't mean that you have a certain set of attributes because you're right-handed or left-handed, and it should be exactly the same way as a person. The problem is, when you're going to university, it's a meritocracy. And how I got started on all of this, well, I shouldn't say, the reason I started thinking about all this when I was working, but when I left work and I would go out and start speaking to women about how I felt they could advance their careers, I would have women come up and talk to me after their talk. And they would come up and say, you know, I was in the College of Commerce. I headed the business school team. We went off to nationals. I had a bunch of guys on my team. They listened to me. They respected me. We won nationals. One of those guys, he and I are now working in the same firm. He's getting naturally mentored, and I'm not. If I make a suggestion, it gets glossed over. He makes the same suggestion, everybody gives him credit for it, and he gets advanced. How did that happen? Like, what they're saying to me is, how did that happen? How did it go from being a meritocracy where we were all just people doing our thing to all of a sudden he's getting advanced because people think that he has the attributes of a leader, and they're putting me, I'm not getting the same opportunities. That to me that's the subconscious bias. And we have to acknowledge that we have it and have the conversation, because then it brings it to the surface and we have the awareness and we can talk about it. I don't want it to be there. And it's almost, I hear what you're saying, it's almost counterintuitive for me to say, I don't want there to be things that are masculine and feminine, but I'm talking about masculine and feminine. So it sounds like that's almost one's contradicting the other. And I thought a lot about whether I should call this hard power, soft power, not even use the words masculine or feminine. But I felt like we had to talk about it, because if we don't, we have to hold up the mirror to see that this is the way society functions. And when you get out and get in the workplace, it's a problem. It's a problem in the way that people expect you to act if you're a woman, and the way that you expect you to act if you're a man. And if you don't exhibit the attributes of the feminine, people don't trust you in the same way. And if you're a woman, and it makes it more difficult then for you to achieve your goals and to be promoted, because you have to be liked to be promoted. I mean, you obviously have to deliver the end product, but there's lots of people delivering the end product. So what it really comes down to is, who do we like? And if people are not living up to these subconscious messages that they've gotten from the time that they were born, it's harder for them to be liked.
I mean, to be honest, I only ever encounter issues with like this kind of, like, people expecting like these gender things from certain generations of people. I think it's a pretty dated thing. Like, you don't pat your secretary on the butt anymore to tell her a good job. And so, I mean, I think once a lot of people retire out of the workforce and we kind of get rid of just that very ingrained mentality, and I don't see it as being as much of an issue.
I think it's getting better for sure with the next generation. Unfortunately, as we continue to train people, It's getting better, but I would like to speed up the process for it to get better.
Yeah. Sorry, no, I noticed Riza has sent a chat. She asked, can you talk about how women are expected to be nice more so than men? In fact, it seems like being nice is a prerequisite for women to get ahead. Are you able to speak to that?
I mean, that's basically what we're talking about here, is that, you know, there's a lot of sort of words, like, you know, what's the difference between assertive and aggressive? Gender. A guy can have behavior and people think that that's good. He's being assertive. He's doing what we need to do to move things forward. And a woman does it. It's like, boy, is she ever aggressive. It's probably one of the reasons that a lot of women have trouble in politics. As soon as any woman says she's running for office, right away, all the articles come out. Do you like her? One of the first, they don't generally talk about men's hair the way they do about women. Before they actually even listen to what a woman has to say, they're saying, do you like her haircut? You know, her bangs are too long, I think, or whatever. So we have all these preconceived ideas, and one of them is that women should be nice. So we think that if women are going to give any kind of feedback, they have to do it in a way that doesn't hurt people's feelings, and that they should be nice about it. I'm very involved in film, and I can tell you that it's more difficult for women to get a lot of the movies that come out, we don't mind. So for example, Hustler, which was a big movie this year with Jennifer Lopez, a lot of men reacted negatively to that movie because Jennifer Lopez, as a prostitute, was drugging a man that she was meeting in a club so that she could get their wallets. Well, men were really offended that a woman should do that because she should be nice. And the men that I had conversations with, I said, why are you so offended? You watch Goodfellas, and those guys were doing all kinds of things that were illegal, but you have this subconscious bias that women should be a certain way and men should be a certain way. And that makes it more difficult for women. So if your question is about being nice, it kind of goes back to that Stanford study, which is that if women are, they have to be able to show the attributes of the masculine in order to be considered a leader. And that's good. They should be. They should be looking at, how do I advance this program? How do I make sure that we do what we need to do to get our results? And I don't want those to be masculine attributes. I want those to be attributes that any good leader exhibits. But because people have a subconscious bias that you're a woman and therefore you should be nice, if you're doing that too much, or maybe not even as much as a man, but he can get away with it, you're going to have to stop and take some time to smile and give somebody a compliment in order for people to think that you're being nice, or they're not going to like you, and that's going to be important. And I hate to say, so for example, in my office, I shared a secretary with another senior executive. He would walk by and just throw something on the secretary's desk and say, I need this by 2 o'clock. I didn't dare do that. I would stop and say, how was the soccer game last night? Did Johnny win? You know, I'm gonna really need this by this afternoon around 2, would that be okay? That's the difference between the way he could deliver and I felt like I had to deliver in order to be considered nice so that people would like me and I would be generally accepted. Laurel, your thing is frozen. I don't know if you have.
Nope.
Okay, good.
So there's another question. Can we also ask about methods and tactics to coach onwards and upwards regarding these biases and behavioral patterns? Wondering about ideas and potential actions for both females and males.
So the bottom line is, I think you have to be able to use the attributes of both genders, or the attributes, I actually, let me correct that, because I think especially Laurel, in view of what you and I discussed, when I say the attributes of both genders, I'm not saying that that's what masculine and feminine, the attributes that we attribute to the masculine and to the feminine. Let's stop and make sure that we're using, that we're not considering those, the attributes of the masculine or the attributes of the feminine, but that they are all attributes that we, each and every one of us, can use. So what I'm saying is, don't use any of them to the extreme. Always make sure that you're balancing. So every time you think of an attribute, think of what its polar opposite position would be and make sure you use it as well so that you don't over-rotate on one. So for example, just thinking about the first one, which would be, it's about the collective, the we versus the me. Make sure that you are seen as part of the group, that you align yourself with the group, find the values that you agree with in the group, but also make sure that you know what your own values are so that you are then aligning yourself with the group where you can balance between this is who I am and I want to be able to express myself in order to find my voice, but I also need and want to be part of a group because no woman or man is an island and I want to be able to advance. So I need both. Or I know what my goal is, but I'm not going to just go for that goal without stopping and thinking about the processes that I need to put in place to reach that goal. I'm going to do both. I'm not going to spend so long on the processes that I never get to the goal. At some point, I'm going to recognize that I have to maybe put aside not making my plan perfect in order to actually get the things moved along. So you're always balancing the two. So what I would say is, I think the most important thing we can do is know who we are so that we can then consider all the attributes and using both sides of all those attributes in order to balance them. Is there any other questions?
Does anyone else have any other questions that they'd like to ask?
Normina here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Betty-Ann. Thank you for excellent. Thank you for spreading such good word out. What I'm finding in my experience is that people actually don't understand what brings the value. They don't understand even some of the powerful or successful, let me say, women don't see feminine as weakness. So in my mind, we don't recognize that feminine side actually brings the value and brings the value in a business and in governance in society. So I know you started your presentation but that way with a story about it, but maybe if you can expand on the that issue that we don't recognize the value of the feminine side in the business in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Normina. Yes, I think we're getting better at it. The attributes that we would typically assign to being feminine, such as being collaborative, being consensual, being empathetic, being a good listener, focusing on the process, being creative, those attributes are increasingly important as we are valuing people. And the more work we're doing globally, the more important it becomes that we make connections with people. So the attributes that we would typically assign to being feminine are those that we are then really needing to be successful in the business world on a global basis. So I think we are definitely leaving behind a lot of the attributes that we would have thought were going to get us there because we're finding that they're not. And if we're going to focus on the stakeholder and focus on, well, this is sustainability is such an important part of moving forward. And we're finding that the bottom line at all costs has not served us well. So we need to be more concerned about the collective. We're recognizing our values are changing, that we need to be more concerned about the collective, that we need to be more open to hearing other people's opinions, to listening, to finding common ground, and to sharing our stories, that we're not, it's interesting, some of the things that are happening right now, facts are losing a lot of their, because there's so many alternate facts out there right now, they're losing their validity. And so it's taking us back to our own personal narrative and the narrative of our collective and those that we believe in. And those are the attributes that come from a different part of who we are. They come from our hearts, not from our heads. And that's where we typically think of the feminine coming from, especially because we have encouraged men so much in our society to squelch their feelings and suppress them and stay in their heads. There's a real rise from the heart as to how important it is to tell our stories, to share, to feel one another's feelings, because that's what creates the glue that keeps us together as a collective. And we're increasingly find that we need that the individualistic, fact-based society hasn't gotten us where we want to be. Does that answer your question?
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute. Yes, thank you. Well, thank you again for spreading or fighting this battle. Maybe you can just add, if I can take a few more minutes. Are you finding in your own experience that things are actually getting better, that people are understanding better the issue of the need to mix these two values or groups of values?
Thank you. Yes, what I'm finding is interesting is that men are waking up to it. They're actually, by and large, many men feel that the way that they really can be a man is to distance themselves as much from the attributes that they would consider to be feminine as possible. And that means that if they don't accept the feminine in themselves, it's hard for them to accept it in others. And that makes it more difficult for women that they're working with, because then those women are not being truly accepted. And so I do think that it's really helping them accept it in themselves, which makes it easier for them to accept it in others. And what I'm really hoping for is ultimately that we see one another as humans first, and that we're just different versions of the same, as opposed to being one or the other. There was because I will go back to film again, there was a film a couple years ago at the TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, called Our Brand is Crisis, and Sandra Bullock played in it. The role was actually written for George Clooney, but he was too busy to play the role. So she read the script, loved it, and went to the producers and pitched them on making it a role for a woman as opposed to a man. And she said they didn't have to really rewrite the script at all. A woman was able to play it. And she said, wouldn't it be great if we could get to a point where we weren't writing scripts for men or women, but we were writing them for people, just for humans. And it wouldn't matter whether a man or a woman took that role. And that's ultimately where we want to get to. We want to get to a point where this is interchangeable. You are simply a leader, and you don't have to be expected to have one set of attributes or another. You're expected to use the right attributes in the right situation at the right time. You see, we really think of a wise leader as being a person that can choose the right option and action for every situation. But if you've only been using half of the actions and the options that are available to you, then you're using only 50%. And you're cutting yourself off from a whole lot of important options that you could have. So it's really important for all of us to be able to use both, and to get rid of the idea that if you're a man, you're supposed to act a certain way, and if you're a woman, you're supposed to act a different way.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments they want to hop in on or hop in with? Okay, going once, twice. All right, well, thank you very much, Betty-Ann. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. It's really interesting, and I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Excellent. All right, have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.